Let's just calibrate our expectations right up front here. This is a guitar synthesizer from 1992. So I'm going to do my best here. But yeah, this totally sounds like load screen music from Road Rash on Sega Genesis. Lots and lots of instruments in there. I'm just going to pick a few, like this polyphonic synthesizer. These soft, airy pads. That bass that kind of makes me miss the old Pizza Hut. That distorted guitar that transforms into a flute. And that actually pretty nice vibraphone. The only thing in there that didn't come out of this was the drums, and I probably could have done that too. Then again, there's a reason they call it Easy Drummer. I've been passively hunting one of these down for a while now, and sometimes they show up and the seller says, yeah, I don't know where the pickup is, I have no way of testing it, and I wanted to get it as a complete package from a seller that had actually used it and didn't just find it somewhere. Obviously, we're good, so let's do a quick overview starting with the GK2 pickup. This mounts directly on the guitar in a semi-permanent manner, and it listens for the pitch being played on each individual string. And that connects through this little wire to this unit over here, where we've got two buttons, a volume knob, and a switch to go between guitar, synth, or both. And your guitar can actually plug into this thing. You need a 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch adapter, which I don't have, and it's okay because I'm not really interested in doing straight guitar out. But if you were, you wouldn't have two cables coming out here because everything goes through this 13-pin cable. So that's pretty slick. Now, getting it attached on here took about a half an hour, and it went something like this. Sorry, I just got caught up in the music there for a moment. One more step, this will be really quick, but it was super important to go and adjust the individual string sensitivity because we want a good strong signal, but we don't want constant pegging. That could be bad. Painful even. But doing this fixed a problem I had where the high E string was just barely registering. This made it a lot more consistent, and now we're good to go. I know what you're here for. Here's the mini montage of synth sounds. So we're surfing between those patches by pulling up a group. That's the first number. In our case, it's just a 1 or a 2 because this hasn't been expanded yet. Within each group, we've got 8 banks, and each bank gives us 4 patches we can select. And we can arrange those however we want in whatever order, but I want to talk more about these patches because they're actually architected a little differently than I had assumed. A patch has, among other things, the name, a first tone, a second tone, and I'll explain that more in a second. There's information about what to do with each string, and there's chorus and reverb settings. I almost think of the patch as the recipe, or at least the name on the recipe, and the first and the second tones are the main ingredients of that recipe. And for most of these patches, we'll really only hear the first tone, so this square lead patch sounds like a square synth lead. But if I switch over to the second tone for this patch, there's a piano in there. This patch came from the factory set to first tone only, so normally you would only ever hear that synth tone, but we just flipped over to the second and heard the piano. We can also select both and hear them both together. So now we get that piano tone up front, and as that decays, the synth sustain starts to shine through, and that lets us craft some really interesting textural patches that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And of course, we can go into each patch and swap out the tones, so maybe I actually don't really like that square lead. Maybe I want something a little darker, like this techno setting. If we do the math, there's 4 patches per bank, 8 banks per group, and we've got the 2 groups. So that's 64 patches. 64 patches, and there's 200 different tones. So stuff like the jazz organ, and the blowpipe, Those are some pretty good sounds, and you might not ever find them unless you start digging into the tone banks, which you should definitely do. And even then, I still have no idea what birth hern is. And of course, we don't have to take those sounds as they come. We can use these knobs up here to adjust the attack, sustain, resonance, and other aspects. So let's just take this violin. And then we'll mess around with a couple of these knobs. We'll dial in a little more attack time. We'll add some chorus, change the resonance. Let's see what that sounds like. We've got our patches with the tones, but here's something that we just can't do without the benefit of this pickup right here. So far, we've been triggering 1 or 2 tones from all the strings. What if we want to assign different tones to different strings? That's a good Rush song. Let's take a patch with 2 different tones. Let's say the vibes and a bass. And then split the strings 4 and 2. So our 4 thinnest strings will trigger the vibes, and the 2 thickest strings will be our bass. It's also possible to shift the tuning of the strings without retuning the guitar. Of course, we can go up and down in half-step increments. That's real easy. But we can also pitch each individual string up or down. So we can have a guitar that's in standard tuning that comes out sounding like it's an E9 open tuning. And it was a little weird recording that because at my desk I can hear the strings ringing out acoustically as well as the retune notes coming out of my DAW. Here's the camera audio of that. But that's not something we would hear with headphones on or in a live situation. Now, speaking of live, let's talk about actually playing this thing. There is a slight delay between the pick attack on the strings and hearing noise come out of the unit, and I've been trying my best to kind of recalibrate my timing to accommodate for that, but it's there, and sometimes it feels longer than other times. That's what she said. You've also got to just be real careful about accidentally brushing up against strings that you don't intend to play, or doing any sort of palm muting stuff, because that can really confuse it. And just in general, I had a hard time getting consistent dynamics from some of those synthesized instruments, especially the orchestral ones with a longer envelope. There's also just the fact that, to quote James Taylor, guitar is not a precise instrument. It's impossible to be dead accurate across the full neck, across all strings, for every position of every note of every chord. I don't care who you are, guitar just doesn't work that way, which is why Leo Fender invented vibrato. Facts. So certain instruments like piano, they tend to always sound just a little pitchy, dog. And I searched all throughout the manual for a fixed pitch, ignore, bend option. Turns out I should have been searching for chromatic mode. Chromatic mode forces the notes into lanes and ignores the pitch bend data, so they'll always be in tune from a chromatic standpoint. So now I can play big chords across all the strings, and it's gonna be in tune even if I'm a little out of tune. The GR-1 has a few effects, but they're nothing really worth writing home about. Here's a flute with no effects. Here it is with some reverb. How about a little undulation from some chorus? And if we want to get fancy, we can dive into the settings and try out some different types of reverbs. We can even pull up a very rudimentary delay. There's even a flange option, but it's not like a whooshing jet engine style flanger, it's just a shorter chorus. So there are effects in here, it's nice that they're there, and I do love this super nice illustration on page 69 showing the signal path using a spigot and bucket analogy. More technical diagrams should be like that. But we want to at least start out in tune, and there's a tuner button right down here, but pressing this doesn't activate the tuner just yet. It switches between patches because we're in play mode. What we need to do is hit the S1 button on our pickup, just like that, and now all these lights are flashing because now we're in performance mode. So let's tune up using this big, beautiful vacuum fluorescent display. I love that. It reminds me of a calculator my dad had once upon a time. And while we're in performance mode, we have access to some pitch bending options. There's this fat mod button which we can use to thicken up the sound with some additional octave voices. You can also swap that out for a vibrato if you want. It sounds like a vibrato. Right next to that, we've got this hold function which will sustain anything that we play while it's triggered. Those buttons are set to momentary by default. I set them to latching because I've got this thing up on my desk and I need to be able to use my hands. Now, we've been so caught up in the synth sounds that we haven't really addressed how to get a normal, unsynthesized guitar sound out of here. Now, as we mentioned, normally the sound comes out of the 1/4-inch jack of your guitar. It goes into an 1/8-inch input on here. I didn't bother picking up the cable because I wasn't really interested in doing both. But then everything comes out of the 13-pin jack, 13-pin cable, into the GR-1. And the GR-1 actually wants nothing to do with your normal unaffected guitar output. So it comes straight out of the back of here. And that's cool because it gives us several options. Ideally, we would take the guitar output and run that into a guitar amp. Actually, we'd probably throw a couple pedals in there because of course we will. And then we take the stereo synth output and run that into a PA because some of the sounds that this is going to generate aren't necessarily safe or intended for a guitar amp, and vice versa. Or we could put an amp sim in this loop, put it back in, and run it all out into a PA, and then just switch back and forth between guitar, synth, and both right from the pickup itself. And that flexibility is really important because I think most guitarists are going to use something like this to just punch in a keyboard part every now and then, not launch into a multi-layered arrangement that lasts the whole song. There's just so much that we can do between the pickup and the synthesizer, but just for context, the manual for this is over 200 pages, and I don't want a 5-hour video, so reality check. How does something like this compare to something newer and smaller and cheaper, like the Boss SY1? The SY1 is pretty fast and mostly accurate, and it's not as precise as the GR1 with the special pickup, but Well, there's your counterpoint right there. It doesn't need a special pickup. And you can upgrade to the SY200 for presets and more tone shaping options, the SY300 to get MIDI in and out, and the SY1000, which is just like a synthesizer supercomputer, complete with, hey, look at that, a 13-pin GK pickup input. But if you're a guitarist who just wants to be able to play the organ intro to Swing Swing by All American Rejects, yeah, the SY1 can definitely get you into that ballpark. Now, despite being the GR-1, this actually isn't the first GR unit that Roland made. There was a whole line of guitar and bass synthesizers before it, and these were synthesizers in the more literal sense, with hardware oscillators and filters. And there's this wonderful website by Wayne Scott Jones all about them. This is a really deep rabbit hole, and it's worth checking out. I actually had no idea that any of these existed before stumbling upon a random link, and there is much more reading to be done. Another option is the WP20G, which is a super basic guitar synthesizer. I've always been curious about that one. So this isn't the first guitar synth, but it's the first in the modern line of guitar synth pedals that uses the 13-pin GK interface. I'm at least like 96% sure that's accurate. That was mostly correct, but maybe a little bit incomplete. It had somehow completely escaped me that the Roland line of guitar synthesizers had become the Boss line of guitar synthesizers, starting with the GM 800, which uses the GK5 guitar pickup, which uses a TRS output instead of a 13-pin cable. There's some other niceties to it as well. So the GM 800 represents the latest and greatest in Roland Boss guitar synthesizer technology. Keep that in mind with what I just said and with what I'm about to say about the GK3 being an upgrade. In theory, we can plug that GK2 pickup into an SY1000 or the newer GR55, although the GK3 is a bit of an upgrade and it's not terribly expensive. Just remember, you do need something to turn its output into actual musical data and or sounds. The pickup itself doesn't generate MIDI. Now, I'm skipping over the built-in recorder sequencer feature of the GR1. It's a big part of this model, but it's just not something that I would ever use, and they also didn't bother implementing it in later GR models. But I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about MIDI, and what's really nice about MIDI is how technology can span literal decades and still just work together. So we can take the MIDI out from the GR1 and plug it into something capable of acting like a sound module, maybe like this Arturia Microbrute. This is a monophonic analog synthesizer, so only one note at a time, but this is a pretty neat trick. I can also plug it into my interface and then drive a software instrument right in my DAW. As far as finds go, there's a lot of fun in here, and there's a lot of very real possibilities going forward. It's got its glitches and shortcomings and 90s weirdness, and I kind of hate to bring this up, but when you leave this plugged in for a while, it gives off kind of a funky smell. Yeah, not sure what that is. But for something this ambitious to still be working after 30 years is, I think, quite an accomplishment. I hope the gear that I'm buying today still works in 2054. So kudos to the hardware, software, and documentation teams at Roland. I paid about $200 for the whole package here, the GR1 and the GK2 pickup, and a couple accessories. I think that's fair for the amount of joy and capabilities that it brings to the table. That said, between this and the PDS 2700, I'm a little burned out on over-the-top 90s pedals for the time being. So the next video will probably be something either brand new or like completely ancient. Maybe both. Curious to hear your thoughts if you've ever used one of these things, or maybe you wanted one, tried it out in the store. But if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you're subscribed. Please come back for more. I'll catch you on the next one.